Al-Qaeda is back, and is about to have its own country. Yeah, you heard me correctly. Mali might be just days or weeks away from becoming the first state in the world governed by affiliates of the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda. Specifically, we're talking about a branch known as the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, JNIM. Well, these terrorists are now getting closer and closer to taking the capital, and if that happens, we'd be looking at the third country to fall into the hands of Islamist groups in just a few years, and the first to do so under the control of the direct heirs of bin Laden. First, it was Afghanistan with the Taliban, then Syria with al-Shara's HTS, and now Mali is on the brink. What seemed like isolated, very specific, and one-off cases is gradually becoming an increasingly disturbing dynamic. Silently, radical Islamism is not only gaining followers, it's also becoming formalized, controlling territories, and even governing countries. And take note, because what's happening in Mali could be even more concerning than the rise to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan, for one simple reason. Mali is much closer to Europe, and many migration routes cross through this country or even begin there. So logically, the risk of this country becoming a jihadist macro base, almost 3 times the size of Spain, should concern us all. Now, it's likely that many of you are not exactly familiar with what is happening in this corner of the world, and I can tell you in advance, none of this is new. But, VisualPolitik community, never before has victory been so close for Al-Qaeda. And the question is, what does all this really mean? How is it possible that Al-Qaeda is resurging in some areas with such force? How could what is happening in this poor, forgotten, and remote African country affect us? Well, we're going to tell you all about that and much more in this video. So, let's get started. What we know so far is that a jihadist group directly linked to Al-Qaeda has completely surrounded Bamako, the capital of Mali. They have blocked fuel and food supply routes, isolated the city, and are waiting for the attrition to take effect before delivering the final blow. In other words, we're witnessing an imminent takeover. And we're not talking about 4 fanatics hiding in a cave lost in the desert. No, we're talking about one of the most powerful armed groups in the entire Sahel, a group that has one goal in mind: to expel all Western-influenced governments and establish their own Islamic caliphate a stone's throw from Europe. Its fighters have received assistance in manufacturing bombs and ideological training from Al-Qaeda leaders in countries such as Pakistan, and now they may be on the verge of ushering in a new era of global Islamic terrorism. So the question is, what about the army? Isn't anyone going to try to stop them? Well, the problem is that government troops are basically trapped.
The longer the blockade lasts, the closer Bamako will be to collapse. It's a vicious cycle. To defeat the JNIM, the junta needs large-scale ground operations and air support. However, both depend on a steady supply of fuel.
Without fuel, advanced weaponry cannot function. And without that, there can be no offensive. And without an offensive, Al-Qaeda will continue to advance. Now, the most disturbing thing is that if the JNIM manages to enter the capital, Mali would become the first state directly controlled by Al-Qaeda, a real country with territory, borders, and a flag, governed under Sharia law and administered by a group that, just a little over 2 decades ago, brought down the Twin Towers in New York. In other words, an achievement that not even bin Laden himself ever came close to accomplishing. And be warned, because this is not just a local tragedy, it's a sign of something much, much bigger. What is truly worrying is that what is happening in Mali is not an isolated case. It is part of a trend, a new wave of radical Islamism that is reshaping the political map of Africa and the world.
U.S. forces try to regroup as Al-Qaeda, Islamic State SO terror, in West Africa. After being evicted from counterterrorism stronghold Niger, U.S. is adopting a smaller military footprint.
Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Somalia. The entire continent has been burning for over a year. Every time a government falls, the jihadists advance one step further. And to make matters worse, the West is no longer there to stop them. France left. The United States left as well. And in their place remained the Russian mercenaries of the Wagner Group, who, instead of pacifying the region, multiplied the violence. But if history teaches us anything, it's that power vacuums do not exist. Every time the West withdraws, or a friendly government falls, someone else takes its place. That's why this video is not about a country lost in the desert, it's about what the takeover of Mali could really mean, a new era in global terrorism. To give you an idea, according to the Global Terrorism Index, the number of countries with recorded attacks rose from 58 to 66 in 2024, the biggest jump since 2018. This trend coincides with the advance of radical Islamism in Africa. So the question now is Africa becoming the new epicenter of global terrorism? How on earth have we come to see this resurgence of Al-Qaeda, and this time with a possible state of its own? And most disturbing of all, why should this concern us in the West? Well, we're about to tell you. Pay attention.
The return of Al-Qaeda.
To understand what's happening now in Mali, we must look to the past. Yes, it's time to travel back in time again, in this case to 2011, the year when it seemed that it was all over. You see, in May 2011, the United States killed Osama bin Laden, the most wanted man on the planet, the symbol of 9/11, and the villain of every movie of the decade. Obama appeared on television, and half the world thought that Islamic terrorism had begun to die forever that night in Pakistan. But no, the reality has been very different. What really happened was something else. Al-Qaeda didn't disappear, it simply transformed itself. From the caves of the Tora Bora to the African Sahel, that immense belt of sand, poverty, and invisible borders that cuts across the continent from side to side, a place where governments barely exist, uncontrolled territories are vast, and weapons are everywhere. In short, the perfect place for a terrorist group to start again from scratch. While the world had its eyes on Syria, Iraq, and the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda changed its strategy. It no longer wanted to be the group that launched high-profile, media-friendly attacks. It wanted to be the group that controlled territory, enforced its justice, collected taxes, and decided who lived and who died in forgotten villages. And so, little by little, the center of global terrorism has shifted from the Middle East to Africa, even closer to Europe. But take note because, as I was saying, this is not just about Mali. This is about an entire continent that is on fire.
I don't want to sound too dramatic, but the country is collapsing before our eyes. Before December 31st, a coup will happen in the Sahel. Mali will go first, and then you'll have the same domino effect that we've seen between 2020 and 2023, with all of these countries falling one after the other.
Exaggeration? Well, be careful, because it may not be. Groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are already operating in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and are advancing towards somewhat more stable countries such as Benin, Ivory Coast, Togo, and Ghana. Notably, JNIM itself has just claimed responsibility for its first attack in Nigeria. 1 soldier killed, ammunition seized, and a video on Telegram that feels like an official announcement along the lines of, "Hello, we operate here too, and we're not going to stop." And keep in mind that Nigeria has 237 million inhabitants, and in reality, this terrorist group is the least of its problems. The country is currently fighting Boko Haram and the local branch of the Islamic State. Nigeria has lost tens of thousands of lives in recent years, and the religious violence in the past few months has been absolutely brutal. So much so that the massacres of Christians have even prompted Donald Trump to take a moment to look at the region.
The United States cannot stand by while such atrocities are happening in Nigeria and numerous other countries. It's not only Nigeria, it's all over. We stand ready, willing, and able to save our great Christian population around the world.
Washington is concerned, and rightly so, because Mali is not the only hotspot. In Burkina Faso, in May, an attack by the JNIM left 200 soldiers dead in the city of Djibo. In Sudan, wars between militia groups are tearing the country apart, massacring Christians, and leaving bloodstains that can be seen from satellite images. In short, Africa is living a real nightmare. But where on earth is this resurgence of radical Islamism coming from? And why now? Well, let's start with the first reason. The first reason is very simple. Jihadists have found inspiration and a playbook that works, written from Kabul and Damascus. And you might be wondering, but what is this formula? Well, no great battles, no epic speeches from conquered palaces. Basically, it's a war of attrition. You cut off roads, extort money, kidnap local leaders, and make people depend on you to get around. And then you wait. In fact, the leaders of the JNIM say it openly. Their goal is to emulate the Taliban. For years, the Western narrative was clear. Extremists always end up losing. Bin Laden was killed. The Islamic State was destroyed. It was sold as a kind of mission accomplished. But then, the Taliban entered Kabul with the tacit approval of the United States. After 20 years of war, the Afghan army, financed, trained, and armed by the West, collapsed within a matter of days. The troops fled. The president escaped by helicopter, and the Taliban paraded with the weapons they'd been left behind. So the motivational message is clear. If they could kick out the Americans, we can kick out anyone. We just have to resist. Something similar happened in Syria, when a former Al-Qaeda affiliate took everyone by surprise and conquered Damascus in 2024. And the worst thing is that all of this has been compounded by a regional breakdown. It's like throwing away your umbrella when it starts to rain. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso left the Economic Community of West African States and formed the Sahel Alliance, promising sovereignty, but in practice, they're more alone than ever. In fact, terrorist groups in the region have also taken advantage of poor government decisions to expand their scope of operations. The result? Less control and cooperation in the region, and an ideal setting for the Afghanistan and Syria playbook to be replicated here. But beware, because this is not the key factor in the rapid rise of terrorism in the Sahel. There's something else that may have been even more decisive. When the referee leaves, the extremes become more entrenched, and in the Sahel, the referee packed up and left a long time ago. We're talking about France first, and the United States second. It all started with a series of coups that shook the region from 2020 onward. In Mali alone, there were 2 in 2020 and 2021. The fact is that the new military governments blamed all their problems on Paris and Washington. Colonialism, sovereignty, foreign powers having more influence than themselves, you name it. And of course, in the United States, the response was automatic. Coup? Perfect. No more aid. In other words, goodbye assistance, goodbye drones, and goodbye intelligence sharing. And without Western support, the military governments of the Sahel had to face the Islamist threat that was spreading throughout the region on their own. So the question is, what do you think they did? Well, what anyone does when their lifelong partner leaves them: seek comfort elsewhere. And in comes Russia with open arms. But we'll tell you more about that in a moment. Back to the West. The fact is that the withdrawal was total. In 2024, the United States pulled more than 1,000 troops out of Niger, its main stronghold in the area. They dismantled 3 bases of operations, including the one in Agadez, which had cost $110 million and was used to launch surveillance drones throughout the desert.
Losing Niger means that we've lost our ability to directly influence counterterrorism and counterinsurgency in the Sahel.
This brought an end to an alliance that had lasted almost a decade and a relationship that was fundamental to counterterrorism operations in the region. Now, Camp Le Monnier in Djibouti is the only permanent US base on the entire continent. France also did much the same. Macron announced the end of the decade of operations and withdrew French troops from the Sahel. So what's happened since then? Well, just what you might imagine. Violence has multiplied. The Sahel region now accounts for 51% of all terrorism-related deaths worldwide, and the number has increased tenfold since 2019. So yes, the West reduced its presence, believing it was getting out of a stalemate, but that just leaves more fertile ground for terrorist activity, ground that Russia has also been sowing. The Wagner Group's presence in Africa dates back to at least 2017. They started in South Sudan and quickly moved into other countries such as the Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, Niger, and Mozambique. Supposedly, the goal was to provide security to their governments, train the army, and eliminate terrorists. In exchange, these governments have been giving Wagner and the Russian state privileged access to natural resources and strategic positions. For example, with rights to gold and diamond mines, and access to strategic locations such as air bases and ports for the Russian armed forces. From Russia's point of view, which is to expand its influence as much as possible to counter that of the West, this has been a very profitable strategy. Not only did they gain positions in Africa, but also resources, which helped them to finance themselves. In fact, such has been its success that the Wagner Group was absorbed by the Russian army in 2024, giving rise to a specific corps for Africa under the direct command of the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Africa Corps. This was precipitated after Wagner's former leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, rebelled against Putin and launched a coup attempt in June 2023. However, he ended up dying 2 months later in an accident on a plane in which he was traveling. So, where does Mali stand in all of this? Well, in June 2025, Wagner formally withdrew from Mali, and its role has been taken over by the new corps we mentioned, the Africa Corps. The problem is that it's the same dog, but with a different collar. The Africa Corps is controlled more directly from the Kremlin, but its members are mostly former Wagner mercenaries and continue to use exactly the same techniques. And here I'm referring to war crimes that include massacres, torture, rape, and looting. Anyone who doesn't toe the Russian line is subjected to indiscriminate reprisals, extrajudicial executions, the destruction of their villages, and repression on a scale that has led many people to start seeing Al-Qaeda as a lesser evil. Yes, that's crazy. The Russians have killed as many or more people than the jihadists, but without praying. The most famous episode was in Mura in 2022, an anti-terrorist operation that ended with more than 500 people killed. The UN investigated, witnesses spoke out, and everyone agreed that Russian mercenaries were shooting at anything that moved. The consequence is more anger, more despair, and more recruitment of new fighters for jihadist groups in the Sahel. However, despite all this, the Malian government continues to ask Putin for help. Russia has promised to send up to 200,000 tons of oil and food every month in exchange for, well, gold mines, lithium contracts, and political support. The irony is that Moscow is selling this as a crusade against Western imperialism. But on the ground, it's not saving Africa, it's plundering it, and in the process, it's fueling the war it claims to want to stop. Now, many of you may be wondering, why should I care about Wagner? Or what happens in the middle of Africa? What does it matter if Al-Qaeda gets a piece of the desert? Well, it does matter. We really should care. What's more, everything that's happening in Mali is going to directly affect Europe. Pay attention.
From the Sahel to Europe.
When a terrorist group manages to establish a state, the consequences are not confined to its map, but spread far and wide. And before you know it, the echo could be heard in Paris, Brussels, or Madrid. If the JNIM manages to consolidate its control over Bamako, we won't be talking about a medieval caliphate lost in the desert. We'll be dealing with a potentially functional state with resources and a legitimizing narrative. In other words, it would have three advantages that make it particularly dangerous. First, territory and refuge. Up until now, Al-Qaeda lived in the shadows, but with a state, it would have secure bases, airfields, warehouses, and borders to defend. It could train fighters in the open and prepare operations with impunity. Second, it would have access to natural resources. Mali is sitting on gold, lithium, and uranium. Yes, the same materials that determine half the world today. With this territorial control, the JNIM could finance itself on an industrial scale, and not just through smuggling. And I can tell you now that there would always be someone willing to do business with them. And third, having a state gives them something that no terrorist group since ISIS has achieved: real religious and political authority. The message would be clear: the West can't beat us. Where they retreat, we rule. And that VisualPolitik community is the best recruitment ad on the planet.
Al-Qaeda propaganda triggers fears of rise in lone wolf terror in Europe.
To give you an idea, between 2014 and 2017, the Islamic State came to control almost a third of Syria and Iraq, and it was during those 3 years that the group projected its violence onto the world stage. They carried out attacks in Paris, Brussels, Nice, Istanbul, London, Barcelona. Hundreds of people died in Europe in attacks inspired or coordinated by the Islamic State. And these were not improvised operations, no. These were financed, trained, and communicated from a safe territory. Every time the Islamic State gained a city in Syria, global recruitment grew. Thousands of young Muslims from Europe, the Maghreb, and Central Asia were duped and joined the caliphate. At its peak, it had more than 40,000 foreign fighters from more than 100 different countries. So the risk of something like this happen again should be taken very seriously. And finally, there is the humanitarian drama, something that could also have a direct effect. If Mali falls into the hands of Al-Qaeda, it's very likely that many thousands, even millions of people will be willing to leave everything behind and emigrate. Farmers have already abandoned their crops due to the violence, which is causing food shortages and a sharp rise in prices across the country. In Bamako, there is panic over the disruption of supply routes to the city. Basic commodities are in short supply in the markets, and many clinics have closed due to a lack of medicines and due to security reasons. All this, combined with the idea of ending up ruled by a group affiliated with Al-Qaeda, could trigger a huge new wave of migration in a short period of time, and many regional and international security problems. And do you know where those immigrants would end up? Well, some would stay in neighbouring countries, but many would try to reach Europe. And that would be the last thing the old continent needs right now. Not only that, but a terrorist state in this area could turn migration flows into a political weapon. It would control routes, charge tolls, and use migration as blackmail. So when someone tells you that Mali is far away, remember that Raqqa, Mosul, and Kabul were too. And yet their attacks and bombs were heard in Paris, Brussels, and Barcelona. Meanwhile, Syrian and Afghan refugees flooded into Europe by the millions in a matter of a couple of years. The thing is, if the recent past teaches us anything, it's that when terrorism is allowed to advance, we all end up paying the price. The question is, will history repeat itself? Well, only time will tell. Of course, it looks bad, and I'm not going to lie to you. But until then, the questions are for you. Are we witnessing the rebirth of Al-Qaeda, or the prologue to something even worse? Should the West intervene again, or is it too late to stop? Leave your opinions below in the comments, and let's start a discussion. And very importantly, if you like this video, give it a like, and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already. Once again, thank you so very much for being there. Take care, and I'll see you next time.